Emily and David froze, trapped between terror and disbelief. The sound continued, hoarse, echoing around the campsite. It was as if the trees and wind were whispering, "Emily," in a slow and eerie melody. How does it know my name?" Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. David gripped her hand tightly, trying to stay calm. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here. Grab your most important things. We're heading back to the car." Emily began gathering to pack their belongings quickly, her hands trembling as she shoved items into her backpack. The haunting voice grew louder, circling their tent as if mocking their fear. David grabbed the flashlight, his jaw set in determination, and gestured for Emily to stay close. They stepped out of the tent cautiously, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The once serene lake was now a black void, the water eerily still. The voice, however, was no longer coming from the lake. It was behind them. Turning slowly, they saw shadows shifting among the trees. David tightened his grip on Emily's hand and whispered, "Run. Now." They sprinted toward the trail leading back to their car, their breaths ragged and heavy. The voice followed, growing louder with each step they took, and now it wasn't just Emily's name. It was David's, too. "Emily? David ... The way it echoed was unnatural, like it wasn't just one voice but several, overlapping and distorted. When they finally reached the clearing where the car was parked, relief washed over them. But just as David reached for the door, the voice called out closer than ever, "Don't leave!" They turned, hearts pounding, to see the figure from the lake standing at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. The dark outline of its face revealed nothing, yet they felt its gaze piercing through them. Without another word, they jumped into the car, David fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life and they sped away, the headlights cutting through the dark forest. Emily looked back only once, and what she saw would haunt her forever. The figure, now standing in the middle of the road, watching as they disappeared into the night. For weeks after, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, she would wake up to faint whispers calling her name, though there was no one there. David tried to reassure her, but deep down, they both knew something had followed them from that lake. And it wasn't done with them yet. Inside the tent, Emily and David were motionless, their eyes fixed on the entrance as that sound, which now seemed like a lament accompanied by a dragged voice, circled around the campsite. The worst part was hearing the voice slowly and hoarsely uttering Emily's name, as if each syllable were loaded with something dark. David, trying to regain his courage, whispered, "I'm going out to see what's happening. It can't be real. It must be someone playing a prank." Emily gripped his arm tightly, her face pale with fear. "Please don't go. No matter what it is, something is wrong here. We need to leave this place now." David hesitated, but the sound was getting louder, closer. He knew they couldn't just ignore it. He grabbed the lantern and slowly opened the tent. When he pointed the light outside, everything was quiet again. "There's nothing here," he said, but his voice betrayed the fear he felt. Suddenly, a noise came from the direction of the lake. Something heavy had fallen into the water. David quickly turned the lantern, illuminating the shore. Emily, now behind him, held her own lantern with trembling hands. They walked slowly toward the sound, their steps echoing on the leaf-covered ground. The lake appeared calm at first, but when they illuminated the surface, they saw something emerging slowly. It was the same figure from the previous night, a dark silhouette with water dripping from its body, completely still, except for the head, which was now watching them with an almost imperceptible movement. "Who are you?" David shouted, his voice firm, although his heart was racing. The figure did not answer. Instead, it began to move slowly toward the shore, the water creating small whirlpools around it. It was then that Emily noticed something strange. It had no face. The light from the lantern illuminated a smooth surface with no eyes, nose, or mouth, but still the thing seemed fixed on her. "David, let's run now," she whispered, pulling him by the arm. They started to retreat, but the figure accelerated, moving out of the water with alarmingly fast movements. The lament returned, louder, echoing across the place. Running as fast as they could, they reached the tent and grabbed the essentials, the car keys and their phones. There was no time to pack up the campsite. They began running down the trail that led to the parking lot, but the thing was following them, the sound of breaking branches and crushed leaves getting closer. Emily glanced back for a moment and saw the figure now chasing them through the forest. Even without a face, she could feel it watching her, as if it had only one goal, to reach her. Finally, they spotted the car in the small makeshift parking lot. David unlocked the doors with trembling hands, and they got in, locking everything immediately. He started the engine while Emily looked frantically around. The sound had stopped. David put the car in reverse, and the headlights illuminated the trail's entrance. There it was, the figure, standing at the edge of the forest, motionless, watching. "Go! Go now!" Emily screamed. David accelerated, and the car sped down the dirt road. But even as they drove away, Emily couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, expecting that thing to chase them. When they finally reached the main road, they stopped to catch their breath. The silence around them was almost deafening, but the sound of the lake and the figure still echoed in their minds. Emily grabbed her phone and tried to call the police, but David placed his hand over hers. "And what are we going to say? That a faceless thing chased us by the lake? They'll never believe us." Without a response, Emily just stared out the window, her mind spinning in circles. They decided to go straight home, but something deeply unsettled them. The next morning, David insisted on returning to the location to recover the camping gear. Emily hesitated, but eventually agreed. When they arrived at the lake, everything seemed intact, except for one thing. On the shore where the figure had appeared, there were deep marks on the ground, as if something heavy had been dragged into the water. They never returned to the lake. Even months later, Emily still had nightmares about the figure, and every now and then, she swore she could hear the sound of that strange lament when she was alone at night. The lake remained in her memory, not as a place of peace and beauty, but as a warning. There are things in the darkness that should not be disturbed. It was the last weekend of summer, and Blackwood Camp in Oregon was alive with laughter and conversations around the campfires. Groups of friends and families were enjoying the last warm days before autumn brought its chilly nights. Among them was Ethan Parker, an experienced guide who had worked at the camp for 3 years. He knew every trail, every corner of the surrounding forest, and had a precise routine to ensure everyone's safety. That night, the sky was starry, and the sound of crickets filled the air as Ethan made his last round. Most of the campers had already gone to bed, and the silence was only interrupted by a distant campfire where children were singing scout songs under the supervision of another guide. He adjusted his lantern and started walking back to his cabin when he heard quick footsteps behind him. Turning around, he found Ava, a 10-year-old girl, tears running down her face and visibly out of breath. "Mr. Parker, my sister is missing," she cried, her words coming out in sobs. Ethan crouched down, trying to calm her. "Ava, breathe deeply. Tell me what happened." Ava explained that she and her 7-year-old sister, Lily, had been playing hide-and-seek near a clearing when Lily suddenly disappeared. They searched everywhere, but Lily didn't respond to their calls. "She wouldn't do this on purpose," Ava insisted, desperation in her voice. Ethan knew the children could easily get lost in the dense trees, but something in Ava's expression made him uneasy. "Stay here," he said, pointing to the main cabin. "I'll call for help and look for your sister. You'll be safe here." With his lantern in hand and a radio in his pocket, Ethan headed to the clearing where Ava said they had been playing. The area was surrounded by tall, dense trees, casting long shadows under the moonlight. He illuminated the ground with his lantern, searching for footprints that might indicate the direction Lily had gone. As he walked through the clearing, he began calling out the girl's name. "Lily? Are you there? This is Mr. Parker. Don't worry, we'll find you." But the only response was silence, until he heard it. A faint cry coming from deep within the forest, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. Ethan immediately followed the sound, crossing a line of trees to reach a nearly invisible trail. The cry seemed closer now, so he continued, dodging low branches and protruding roots. "Lily, is that you?" he called again, but the sound stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating, and Ethan felt a strange pressure in his chest, as if something was wrong. He stopped for a moment, shining his lantern around. The beams of light danced across the trees, creating moving shadows. Then something caught his attention, a small teddy bear on the ground. Ethan crouched down and picked it up. "This must be hers," he murmured. Before he could take another step, the cry started again, louder, almost desperate, coming from further ahead. Rushing, he followed the sound until he reached an opening in the forest. It was a small stream, surrounded by rocks and tall bushes. He illuminated the area, but there was no sign of Lily. The cry, however, seemed to come from the other side of the stream. Ethan was about to cross when he noticed something chilling, a pair of small footprints in the mud, but they ended abruptly at the shore. There were no marks indicating the child had crossed. "Lily!" he called again, his voice now trembling. That's when he heard it. Not the cry, but something much more disturbing. A laugh. It wasn't a child's laugh. It was low, hoarse, and echoed all around him. Ethan spun quickly, shining the light into every corner of the clearing. "Lily, stop playing!" "This isn't funny," he said, trying to stay calm, though fear crept into his voice. The laugh stopped as suddenly as it had started, and silence returned. Ethan felt his skin crawl, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. He grabbed the radio and tried to call the other guides, but the signal was filled with static, making communication impossible. Suddenly, a sharp scream cut through the air from the other side of the clearing. Ethan ran toward the sound, his heart pounding, but when he arrived, he found only the emptiness of the forest. But on the ground, there was something unexpected, the same teddy bear, as if it had been deliberately left there. "Lily, where are you?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the darkness, but there was no answer. Only the rustling of leaves in the wind and the unsettling feeling that he was no longer alone. The silence at Pinewood Camp that night was almost deafening. The fear that spread among the counselors after Anna disappeared was palpable. Everyone avoided talking about it, as if naming the fear would make it more real. The forest, which had once seemed welcoming during the day, had turned into a sinister place full of secrets during the night. After an initial search around the camp and its surroundings, the authorities decided to wait until dawn to extend the search. Sarah, one of Anna's closest counselors, couldn't rest. Something about the disappearance of the girl troubled her deeply, especially the reports from the other children who insisted that Anna had been following someone. Who could it be? As the clock struck 2 a.m., Sarah decided to act. With a lantern in hand and her heart racing, she left the counselor cabin without telling anyone. If something had happened to Anna, maybe she could still be found. As she walked toward the area where the girl had been seen last, Sarah felt the forest watching her. The shadows of the trees seemed to move, and the nighttime noises sounded amplified. "Anna!" she called, trying to keep her voice steady, but the echo of her cry sounded empty in the darkness. She walked toward the lake where some of the children had mentioned seeing Anna last. When she reached the shore, she saw small footprints like those of a child, but there was something strange. They ended abruptly, as if Anna had simply vanished. As she examined the footprints, a faint sound caught her attention. It was a muffled cry coming from deep within the forest, not far from where she stood. Sarah gripped the lantern tightly, trying to convince herself it was just the lost girl. "Anna," she called again, walking slowly in the direction of the sound. The closer she got, the more the cry seemed to change, becoming distorted. Something in her instinct told her to turn back, but the thought of leaving Anna alone made her continue. Finally, she reached a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. In the center of the clearing, there was a small figure sitting with its back to her. Sarah froze when she recognized the dress Anna had been wearing that night. "Anna, thank God you're all right," she said, relieved, running toward the girl. But as she approached, she realized something was wrong. Anna was motionless, not responding or even turning to face her. Sarah kneeled beside her and touched her shoulder. When Anna finally turned her face, Sarah felt the terror freeze every fiber of her body. The girl's eyes were glazed, as if she couldn't see anything. Her face was pale, and there was something in her expression that was wrong, as if it wasn't really Anna. Before Sarah could say anything, the girl murmured something in a hoarse voice. "He's coming." Before Sarah could react, a loud, guttural noise echoed through the forest. It was a sound that didn't seem human, something primal and full of malice. Anna began to laugh, but her laugh was cold and emotionless. It was then that Sarah noticed a shadow moving in the trees around them. Something large, fast, and clearly not human. Without thinking twice, Sarah grabbed Anna and tried to run, but the girl resisted as if she wanted to stay. "You don't understand," Anna screamed. "He wants me to stay." Sarah ignored the girl's protests and ran as fast as she could back to the camp, but the sound of the creature in the forest seemed to get closer with every second. Branches broke, and the ground seemed to tremble with every movement of that thing. When she finally reached the edge of the camp, Sarah collapsed on the ground with Anna in her arms. The girl was now unconscious, but at least she was alive. The other counselors, attracted by the noise and Sarah's desperation, came running to help her. When Sarah tried to explain what had happened, no one believed her. They said she must have imagined things, that fear had made her hallucinate. Anna was taken to the nearest hospital the next morning. She was in shock and couldn't speak about what had happened. Sarah, however, knew she hadn't imagined anything. Something had been in the forest that night, something that wanted Anna, and maybe all the children at the camp. The summer season was cut short at Pinewood Camp. Many parents, worried about the reports of Anna's disappearance, decided to pull their children from the camp. The case was never officially explained, and the forest kept its secrets. To this day, Sarah still has nightmares about that night. Sometimes she wakes up with the feeling of being watched, as if the shadow of that thing is still nearby. But what haunts her the most is remembering Anna's words in the clearing. "He's coming." Because, deep down, Sarah knew that what she found in the forest would not remain trapped between the trees forever. Hello everyone on the channel. I've been trying to organize this story for weeks because to this day, just remembering it sends a chill down my spine. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life, and it happened during a camping trip that was supposed to be peaceful and memorable. It all started when I, Jack, and my friends, Ethan and Tyler, decided to break the routine and spend a weekend camping in the Smoky Mountains, Tennessee. The idea was to disconnect from the world and relax amidst nature, away from the worries of work and everyday life. We chose an isolated spot, far from any city or main road. It was a beautiful clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a small stream running beside it. It seemed perfect. We arrived at the location in the late afternoon, set up our tents, and prepared everything for the night. While Ethan gathered firewood and Tyler worked on the food, I adjusted the final details of our camp. Everything was going well, and when night fell, we gathered around the campfire, talking and telling stories while the stars shone above us. After a few hours, when the fire was starting to die down, we decided it was time to sleep. We each entered our tents, and soon the camp fell silent, only the sounds of the forest filling the air. We were exhausted from the long hike there, and sleep came quickly. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It was like something was scratching the side of my tent. I froze, holding my breath, trying to identify what it could be. Maybe an animal? A raccoon or some other curious creature? But the sound was continuous, dragging, almost methodical. It didn't seem natural. "What is that?" I thought, feeling my heart race. I called out softly to Ethan and Tyler, but there was no response. I grabbed my lantern from beside my sleeping bag and turned it on, illuminating the inside of the tent. The light passed through the fabric walls, but revealed nothing beyond what was already inside. I then gathered some courage and slowly unzipped the door, trying not to make any noise. Outside, the forest was engulfed in darkness. The lantern's light illuminated only a small radius ahead of me, and everything seemed eerily calm. The scratching sound had stopped. I kneeled at the entrance of the tent, sweeping the light around the area, but there was no sign of anything. No animal, no branch, nothing that could have caused the noise. It was then that I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Small human footprints. They started a few meters from my tent and led directly to it, stopping right where I was kneeling. My body froze. Ethan and Tyler were asleep, so who could have walked up to my tent in the middle of the night? With my breath quickening, I went outside to investigate. I followed the footprints for a few meters in the opposite direction, until I noticed something even stranger. They simply stopped in the middle of nowhere. There was no sign of anyone having turned around or continued down another path. It was as if the person had disappeared into thin air. I went back to the camp and decided to check my friends' tents. First, I went to Ethan's and carefully called for him. Nothing. "Ethan," I said louder, and he finally responded with a groggy voice. "What's up, man? Is everything okay?" I explained what I had seen, but he just laughed and said I was imagining things. Probably an animal or something. Go back to sleep. Frustrated, I went to Tyler's tent and told him the same thing. He seemed more concerned, but still said it could be some kind of prank or just my mind playing tricks in the dark. I decided to let it go, even though a strange feeling lingered with me. I went back to my tent, but I couldn't sleep. The silence of the forest felt heavier, as if something was hidden among the trees watching us. Every small noise made my heart skip a beat, but the night eventually passed, and the sun began to rise. When we emerged from the tents that morning, we all pretended like the night had been normal, but I knew something was wrong. Then, as we started to break down the camp, Tyler found something that made all of us stop. More footprints, this time scattered around all of our tents. And once again they started and ended in the middle of nowhere. "Ethan, this isn't just in my head," I said, pointing to the ground. He turned pale and stepped closer, speechless. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do, but deep down we all knew this wasn't going to be a simple camping trip. Something was watching us in that forest, something that shouldn't have been there. And unfortunately, it didn't seem like it was over. The next day was supposed to be just the end of an ordinary camping trip. We woke up early, the sun was shining, and the forest seemed more welcoming under the light of day. However, the discovery of the footprints around the tents left a tension in the air. Ethan, who had previously mocked my concern, was now visibly unsettled. Tyler was even quieter, and we all exchanged glances as if we were waiting for someone to offer a rational explanation. But no one said anything. As we broke down the camp, the forest was strangely silent. The usual sounds of birds and insects seemed to have disappeared, replaced by an oppressive calm. Still, we tried to stay focused on packing our things quickly and getting out of there. But before we finished, a distant sound echoed through the trees. The snap of a branch, followed by slow footsteps. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, breaking the silence. Tyler stopped folding his tent and looked in the direction of the sound. Ethan, trying to mask his fear, let out a nervous laugh. "Probably a deer or something," he said, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as before. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my lantern, even under the daylight, and walked toward the sound while the others stayed behind. I moved maybe 20 meters from the camp, always looking back to make sure I could still see Ethan and Tyler. But when I turned my head forward again, I stopped dead in my tracks. On the ground there were more footprints. Now they were different, larger, deeper, as if someone were walking barefoot with force. I followed the marks for a few meters, and they led to an area where the trees were denser. When I looked beyond the shade of the treetops, I saw something that made my heart freeze. A figure standing between the trees, wearing a kind of hood. It was motionless, facing directly at me, as if it knew I was there. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, head slightly tilted to the side, as if analyzing me. Fear took over me, and I took 2 steps back. When I tripped over a dry branch and looked forward again, the figure had disappeared. I ran back to the camp out of breath, trying to explain what I had seen. "There's someone in the forest. I saw a person right there." I yelled, pointing in the direction I came from. Tyler and Ethan dropped everything and grabbed their backpacks, their faces now reflecting the same terror I felt. "We don't have time to argue. Let's get out of here now," Ethan said, grabbing his backpack and leading the way back to the trail. We hurried along, our hearts pounding. The path out seemed longer than it should have, and the feeling of being watched never went away. Every time we looked back, it seemed like shadows moved between the trees, always out of sight. As we ran along the trail, the sound of footsteps behind us became more evident. They weren't ours. It was as if someone was following us, keeping a safe distance. Suddenly, Tyler stopped abruptly and pointed to something ahead. There were more footprints on the ground, fresh, going in the opposite direction of ours, but still close enough to make us hesitate. "They're surrounding us," Tyler whispered, his voice trembling. No one questioned the they. We knew it wasn't just one person. It wasn't just an impression. We weren't alone. We quickened our pace, adrenaline pushing our tired legs. When we finally spotted the spot where we had left the car, a wave of relief washed over us, but also a sense of desperation. We were about 50 meters from the vehicle, and the footprint still led in its direction. "Quick, get in the car!" I shouted. We all ran at once, throwing our backpacks in the trunk and getting in a hurry. Ethan started the engine with trembling hands, and the car shot off with a loud screech of tires against the dirt. As we drove away, I looked through the rearview mirror and saw something I will never forget. 3 figures standing at the trail entrance, all wearing hoods. They just stood there, motionless, watching as we left. The drive back was in complete silence. No one wanted to talk about what had happened, perhaps out of fear of giving more strength to whatever that was. When we finally reached the town, we parked the car at a gas station, and Tyler broke the silence. "Do you think they followed us?" No one answered, but we all looked toward the horizon, waiting, fearing, wondering if those figures might appear again at any moment. Since then, I've never returned to that forest, and I've never camped in such isolated places again. Something was there, something I still feel, as if it's waiting, lurking in the shadows. Hello everyone on the channel. Reporting this isn't easy at all. It's been a few years, but the feeling of unease and fear still returns when I think about that night. It was during a camping trip that my friends and I decided to take to relax and get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. It seemed like a perfect idea. Nature, a campfire, and good laughs. But what started as a peaceful weekend turned into a nightmare none of us expected. It was early October, and autumn was coloring the forest in shades of orange and gold. The place we chose was a few hours' drive from the city, in the middle of a state park known for its trails and isolated camping areas. The group consisted of me, Ryan, my best friend, and the couple Emily and Chris. We were all excited to spend 2 days disconnected, just enjoying the outdoors. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon. The camping area was in a clearing near a small stream. The setting was perfect. Tall trees around us, the soft sound of running water, and the absolute silence that only nature can offer. We quickly set up the tents and gathered wood to light the campfire, planning to spend the evening with marshmallows, stories, and good conversation. When the sun began to set, we lit the fire and sat around it. The warmth of the fire was comforting against the cool night air, and the flames danced, lighting up our faces. We laughed and joked, talking about everything and anything, when Ryan suggested telling scary stories. It was a classic, and no one hesitated to join in. Chris started with a typical camping story about a creature that roamed forests like this one. Then it was Emily's turn, who told an urban legend from the city where she grew up. We all nervously laughed, enjoying the spooky atmosphere, but still feeling safe. It was then that I noticed something. On the other side of the clearing, in the shadows of the trees, there seemed to be a silhouette. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me because of the stories, but the more I looked, the more sure I was that someone was there. "Hey, are you guys seeing this?" I asked, interrupting Chris, who was in the middle of a new story. "Seeing what?" Emily replied, turning to where I was pointing. "Over there, by the trees." Everyone looked, but no one seemed to notice what I saw. Chris shook his head and laughed. "You're getting into the spirit of the stories, man. Relax. I decided not to insist, though my discomfort remained. The campfire kept burning, and the stories continued, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Soon after, Ryan decided to get more wood to keep the fire going. He stood up and disappeared into the darkness for a few minutes. When he came back, he was unusually quiet, carrying some dry branches. "Are you okay?" I asked, noticing the serious expression on his face. "Yeah. I think I saw someone walking along the trail near here," he said quietly, trying not to alarm Emily and Chris. "What? Are you sure?" "I don't know. It might have just been my imagination," he replied, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe that. We tried to act as if nothing was wrong, but the mood shifted. The campfire, which had once seemed comforting, now felt like our only protection against the darkness around us. Every snap of the branches in the trees sounded louder. Every gust of wind seemed like a whisper. Later, it was well past midnight when Emily suggested it was time to sleep. We agreed, though none of us seemed really comfortable. Before heading to my tent, I took one last look around, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the soft sound of the leaves rustling outside, I heard something that made my heart race. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, circling our now nearly extinguished campfire. I looked at Ryan, who was in the same tent as me, and saw that he had heard it too. We lay in silence, breathing quietly, trying to understand what was happening. The footsteps continued, stopping occasionally, as if whoever it was listening. And then, an even more disturbing sound, a low laugh, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere outside. The sounds outside continued to paralyze us with fear. Ryan and I exchanged glances, trying to decide what to do without saying a word. The laughter was spaced out, interspersed with slow, methodical footsteps. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. The air inside the tent felt heavier, as if the terror we were feeling was draining all the oxygen. "Did you hear that?" Ryan finally whispered, barely moving his lips. "I heard it. What do we do?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. Before we could decide, the sound of footsteps increased, now closer. Whoever was out there was circling the tents. The laughter came again, this time louder, and seemed to have a morbid tone of amusement. Suddenly the sound stopped, and the clearing plunged into an oppressive silence. For a few minutes no one moved. I thought maybe it was over, that the intruder had left. But then, the sound of something scraping against the fabric of the tent made my blood run cold. It was right there, outside. Ryan gripped my arm tightly, and I could barely breathe. "Who's out there?" Chris's voice echoed through the clearing, interrupting the silence. He was in the other tent, and he had probably heard the sounds too. There was no answer. For a few seconds, everything remained quiet again. But then, a loud bang on the side of Chris and Emily's tent broke the silence, followed by Emily's scream. Ryan and I couldn't stay still any longer. I grabbed the lantern beside my sleeping bag and turned it on. "We need to get out of here," I whispered to Ryan. He nodded, and we both started opening the tent, trying to make as little noise as possible. As we stepped out, we pointed the lantern toward the now extinguished campfire. There was no one in sight, but the footprints in the soft earth around the campfire were unmistakable. Chris and Emily had also left their tent, visibly terrified. "Did you see anything?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No, we just heard someone walking and banging on the tent," Chris replied, holding Emily by the shoulders. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps returned, this time coming from the forest, right next to the clearing. The lantern I was holding illuminated the trees, but I couldn't see anything. Panic took over, and Chris shouted, "Let's get out of here now." We grabbed the essentials, keys, phones, lanterns, and started running down the trail leading to the parking lot where our cars were. It was a desperate run, with branches scratching us and the sound of our footsteps echoing along the path. But the most terrifying part was the sound of something, or someone, following us. Ryan looked back for a moment and shouted, "Someone's coming!" I didn't have the courage to look. My only concern was to keep running. When we finally saw the parking lot, it seemed like we had reached salvation. We ran to the cars, unlocking the doors in a hurry. We piled into my car and I started the engine. As soon as the headlights lit up the path ahead, we saw a figure standing at the entrance of the trail. It was hard to distinguish who or what it was, but the figure stood motionless, just watching us. It wore something dark and had a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its face. The terror I felt at that moment was indescribable. Without hesitation, I accelerated and left the parking lot. No one said a word during the entire drive back to the city. When we finally got home, we locked all the doors and stayed awake until dawn, still trying to process what had happened. We never knew who or what had chased us that night. We returned to the park a few days later, but all we found were the ashes of the campfire and our abandoned tents. The footprints around the site were still there, but there was no clue about who the figure that terrified us was. That night completely changed my perspective on camping. As much as I love nature, I've never been able to camp again without thinking of the sounds in the darkness and the figure standing on the trail. Something was wrong in that forest, and I hope to never cross paths with whatever or whoever was watching us that night. Everything started on a hot summer night while I was lying on the couch in the living room, trying to finish a documentary about space. My name is Lucas, and at the time I was living alone in a small town in the heart of Nebraska, surrounded by endless fields and forests. Solitude had become a comfortable routine for me, but that night proved that even tranquility can hide something disturbing. As my eyes began to get heavy, the house's landline phone rang. Yes, I still used a landline, an old habit I never bothered to change. The sharp sound made me jump off the couch, my heart racing from the surprise of the late-night ring. I looked at the clock on the wall, 1:23 a.m. No one ever called me at that hour, so I walked toward the phone with some hesitation, wondering if it was just some mistake. I picked up the receiver and said, "Hello?" On the other end, there was silence. Not a normal silence, but something that felt heavy, as if someone was there, listening to every word I said. "Who's there?" I asked again, my voice trembling slightly. Then, a breath, slow, hoarse, as if someone was trying to suppress the sound but still failing. "Lucas," a deep, distorted voice whispered, almost a growl. My heart froze. "Who's speaking?" "How do you know my name?" I demanded, but the line went silent again. There was no answer, only the sharp click of the phone being hung up on the other side. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, maybe bored teenagers or some sick joke. But something about that voice unsettled me deeply. I decided to ignore the incident and went back to the couch, though sleep was now out of reach. Shortly after, the phone rang again. It was the same unknown number. Reluctantly, I answered. "Lucas." The same voice whispered, this time followed by a muffled, almost sarcastic laugh. "Look, I don't know who you are, but stop calling me," I shouted into the phone before hanging up forcefully. I could feel my body trembling, but I tried to stay calm. I decided to take the phone off the hook and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water to calm myself down. While drinking, I noticed something strange. The porch lights, which usually stayed on, were off. I walked over to the window to look, and that's when I saw something that made my stomach turn. Across the street, on the sidewalk in front of my house, there was a figure standing. It was motionless, almost like a statue, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its face. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, the figure slowly turned its head, as if it knew I was watching. I pulled away from the window, my heart pounding like a drum, and quickly closed all the curtains in the house. I grabbed my cell phone to call the police, but before I could dial, a loud knock on the door echoed through the living room. The knock was rhythmic, as if someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice faltering. There was no response. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer and cautiously approached the door. I couldn't bring myself to look through the peephole. The knocking stopped suddenly, but then I heard something even more terrifying. Footsteps. They were moving away, but not toward the street. They were heading around the side of the house. A growing panic set in and I ran to check the windows. Looking out the side, I saw no one. But when I reached the back of the house, my heart almost stopped. The glass door that led to the backyard was ajar, and I knew I had locked it before heading to the living room. With the knife in hand, I slowly approached, trying to hear any movement. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Suddenly, the landline phone rang again, its sound echoing through the dark house. I knew I shouldn't answer, but it was as if something compelled me to do so. With hesitant steps, I walked over to the phone and picked up the receiver. "Lucas," the voice whispered again, followed by a short, disturbing laugh. Before I could respond, the line went silent once more. My breath was quick, and my mind spun in circles, trying to comprehend what was happening. That's when I heard another sound, a creak from upstairs. I knew I wasn't alone in the house. The creak from upstairs echoed through the house like a dark warning. I froze in the middle of the living room, the phone still in my hand, unable to think of my next move. My heart was pounding so loudly it seemed deafening. Who was up there? How had they gotten in? With the knife still firmly in my hand, I decided I had to face whatever it was. I called the police on my cell, speaking softly as I walked toward the stairs. "Please, I need help. There's someone in my house," I whispered to the 911 operator, who assured me that a patrol car was on the way. The silence in the house was so thick that each of my footsteps on the wooden floor sounded like thunder. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stood still, trying to hear anything else. Another creak, this time louder. The person was in the upstairs hallway. I began to climb slowly, each step creaking annoyingly. I gripped the knife tightly, sweat running down my face. When I reached the top, the hallway looked darker than it should have, as if a heavy shadow was lingering there. "Who's there?" I called, trying to sound confident. No answer. The only thing I could hear was my own heavy breathing. I started walking down the hallway, checking each room. The first was empty, the second too. When I reached my bedroom, I saw something that made me shudder. The window was open, and the curtain was gently swaying in the wind. But I was certain I had closed and locked it before coming downstairs. Slowly I approached the window, hoping to find some clue. That's when I heard a low, hoarse laugh behind me. I turned quickly, the knife raised, but there was no one there. The laugh seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the house itself was mocking me. My instinct screamed for me to leave, but my feet were glued to the floor by fear. Suddenly, the landline phone in the living room began to ring again. The sound echoed through the house, slicing the silence like a knife. I ran downstairs, my mind spinning with dread. When I reached the living room, I grabbed the phone with trembling hands and answered. "You should never have gone upstairs," the voice said, followed by a long, disturbing laugh that made my stomach churn. That's when I realized I hadn't locked the front door when I went downstairs. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and before I could react, I felt a cold breeze coming from the entryway. The door was open. "Lucas," the voice called again, this time not from the phone, but from the darkness outside. I grabbed my cell phone and ran into the backyard, desperate to escape. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, but one thing was clear. I wasn't safe inside my own house. I heard heavy footsteps behind me, so I instinctively turned around and saw the figure with the hat. He was standing in the middle of the room, his imposing silhouette framed by the dim light from the street lamp outside. The front door was ajar, like a sick invitation for me to come back. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice echoing into the night. He didn't answer. He just started walking toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. I knew I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I needed to act. With the knife still in my hand, I forced myself to face my fear and shouted, "If you take one more step, I will defend myself." The figure paused for a moment, his head tilting slightly to the side as if studying me. Then he laughed. It wasn't a natural laugh, but something distorted, grotesque, like he was mimicking a human laugh. The siren of a patrol car sounded in the distance, cutting through the tension. The figure seemed to notice, and in one quick movement he disappeared into the darkness of the backyard. I ran to the front gate, the patrol car headlights lighting up the street as the officers jumped out of the car with guns drawn. "He's here! He was in my house!" I yelled, pointing to the backyard. The officers searched the area but found no one, no sign of the man. Just the front door open and my bedroom window wide open. After calming me down, the officers said they would patrol the area and advise me to reinforce the security of the house. But the sense of danger lingered. That night changed everything for me. I spent weeks trying to understand who or what that man was. I never answered an unknown call again, and I couldn't sleep without checking the lock several times before going to bed. To this day, I don't know if he was just trying to scare me or if he planned something much worse. But one thing I know for sure: when the night falls and silence takes over, I feel like I'm still being watched. And sometimes, deep in my mind, I can hear that laugh echoing again.